Good afternoon, everyone. Why don't we go ahead and get started? We're a couple minutes late. Welcome to this public event, Bridging Strategies about Infrastructure Efforts in Southeast Asia in an Era of Great Power Competition. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm the Senior Vice President here at the Atlantic Council and the Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Thank you for joining us today, and also want to extend a special thanks to our partner, the Embassy of Japan, for their generous support of our efforts. Today's event will examine how Southeast Asia, which is a rapidly growing region of about 650 million people, has become a priority destination for U.S. and Japanese infrastructure investment in the Indo-Pacific, obviously, as well as Chinese infrastructure investment under their Belt and Road Initiative framework. And the real point, I think, for us here is that this is a strategic set of issues. It's not only about infrastructure, it's about geopolitical influence as well. And so I hope that the discussion will provide fresh insights into how regional infrastructure projects fit into the intensifying strategic competition in this part of the world between the United States and China, and among the United States and China and Japan, as well as I'm sure our panelists will have concrete policy recommendations for how can the United States, Japan, like-minded allies and partners, best operationalize new policies on quality infrastructure, but with an eye toward the geopolitical questions which are swirling around all of this. And I'm just back from the Munich Security Conference last weekend, and this issue obviously was one of the many issues discussed among all the officials gathered there. This event has been organized by the Scowcroft Center's Asia Security Initiative, where we aim to leverage strategic foresight to promote forward-looking strategies and practical solutions for the most pressing challenges affecting the region, but also for the opportunities. And so we're increasingly looking at both traditional challenges and opportunities, as well as non-traditional challenges and opportunities, especially those related to China's continuing rise, as well as how can the United States, in light of all of that, best develop a new rules-based system, an adapted rules-based system, because we're in a very different era from when those rules and practices were developed. How can we all work together to come up with a new rules, including working with China wherever it's appropriate and wherever it comes out in a way that does not cause us to sacrifice our own values and our own interests. And I certainly think there are significant areas where that can be the case. So this effort connects broadly with the Scowcroft Center's mission here at the Atlantic Council, where we work hard to honor General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embody his ethos of nonpartisan commitment, a very important word these days, to the cause of security and support for U.S. leadership in close cooperation with allies and partners, as well as dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders who are working on these problems. So we're very thankful to be conducting today in service of this mission and to have such a great panel of speakers. I'm really looking forward to it. As a reminder, this event will be webcast live and on the record. Please join the conversation, as I will, on Twitter at the Scowcroft Center Twitter account, at AC Scowcroft, and the hashtag is hashtag ACAsia. And with that, I'd like to invite our panel to the stage to get things started. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank everyone for coming out to join us today, and especially to the Atlantic Council for hosting this event, which promises to be a wonderful discussion. At least I'm confident our panelists will make it that way. Hopefully I can help a little bit. So Japan and the US have a decades-long history of investing in Southeast Asia. China as well, particularly in the last 20 years, has been very active. All of this has really started to gain global attention, particularly geopolitical attention, as Barry was mentioning, with the announcement of China's Belt and Road Initiative. I think that's forced a lot of governments to rethink their own projects in terms of how to respond to what the Chinese are doing, how we can be doing things better, and how we can be partnering more closely with Southeast Asian governments. And we have an excellent panel here to discuss various aspects of this infrastructure challenge. We're going to start with Jonathan Hellman, who is a senior fellow in the Simon Chair Political Economy and the director of the Reconnecting Asia project at CSIS. And then we're actually going to move to Makoto Iori here, who is a visiting senior fellow here at the Asia Security Initiative, the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security here at the Atlantic Council. And then Bart Adesh from the Asian Development Bank is going to speak next. And finally, Myeon Oh, who is also here at the Asia Security Initiative. She is the director of the program. So I'll let Jonathan kick us off. He's going to be discussing some of the general context of infrastructure needs and projects in Southeast Asia for us.
Great, thank you. And I think this is a great event for anyone who's been following the Belt and Road. And I say that because when I look at Belt and Road activity globally, Southeast Asia to me is really the main battleground. This is an area where infrastructure needs are quite great. About $210 billion a year of infrastructure need, according to the Asian Development Bank. Bart can maybe say more about that than I can. But the need is great, and from China's perspective, it's really reaching down. It's reaching sort of a north-south strategy, and this is one of the areas in which the overland belt and the maritime road meet. So it's right in China's backyard, and yet China is in many respects the newcomer to this area. Japan is the incumbent. Has been building and delivering large projects in Southeast Asia for decades. And it's actually quite striking if you go back and look at, in the 1980s, some of the criticism about Japan and its approach to delivering infrastructure is somewhat similar to some of the criticism we hear today about China. That Japan was using loans that were, the interest rates were too high, using too many of its own, preferencing its own companies. Even the terms predatory economics were thrown around in Congress. And so this is an area in which Japan has been very active, and it's learned a lot over the decades. And I think there's a really positive story to be told there about its transition from going in heavily to these areas and then becoming, learning through that process and becoming a defender of really high standard infrastructure, and that's what we see today. Japan is actually outspending China still in most of Southeast Asia. And so, data on all of this, especially the Chinese projects, is hard to find. Transparency is a real challenge when you're trying to analyze what China is doing. But one estimate last year put the total of Japanese projects in the region at about 360 billion, and I think China was at about 270 billion. The levels are very close in several key countries like Indonesia and Thailand. And of course, the countries themselves are very important players, and I know that's something that we're going to get to today as well. I think it would be a mistake just to cast this as a competition between Japan and China, because the recipient countries, the countries of ASEAN, in many cases are the most influential actors. They go out, they court investment from multiple sources, they have their own ambitions and their own agency, and that's something that we're seeing play out as well. So why don't I leave it there, and I'm happy to hand it off.
Okay, great. So you'd mentioned Japan's long history, and that's a perfect lead in because Makoto has promised to talk about that history.
Very good introduction to my presentations, and I get some time to explain what Japan has done for the Southeast Asia for the ODA in terms of the ODA. Actually, Japan's ODA covers a variety of sectors, ranging from infrastructure, agriculture, education, health, water resource development, maritime security, environment, disaster management, and governance. One of its main policies has been cooperation aimed at self-reliant development through assistance for self-help efforts, as well as dialogue and collaboration based on Japan's experience and expertise. This explains why Japan's ODA project has been provided based upon the request from each recipient government, and more than 60% of Japan's ODA fund has been extended in the form of yen loan. Its target has been more development cooperation and economic growth, rather than just charity or aid to the poor people. The dictum of Japan's ODA is that it would be better teaching how to fish rather than just giving fish. Therefore, technical assistance, capacity building has always been the top priority of JICA. As for Japan's ODA towards Southeast Asia, Japan has extended more than the total of 130 billion US dollars since the 1960s. The main characteristic is it's focusing on three categories, namely transport, energy, and human resource development. These three categories account for almost 50 to 70% of the Japan's past ODA for Southeast Asia. Since the 1960s, Japan built many airports, including Kuala Lumpur Airport and Bangkok International Suvarnabhumi Airport. To facilitate trade in archipelago countries, Japan constructed and upgraded Batangas, Cagayan de Oro, and Subic container ports in the Philippines. The Patimban Port project in the east of Jakarta, Indonesia, is another big project which started construction last year. Roads have been another Japan's priorities in Southeast Asia countries. Japan has constructed most of the Pan-Philippine highways, which connect north end of Luzon to the southern part of Mindanao. Also built 60% of Trans-Sumatra Highway in Indonesia with a total length of 1,500 miles. In Vietnam, in the 1990s, on the National Highway Number 1 project, which connects the north to the south along the east coast of Vietnam, Japan rebuilt all old bridges, while World Bank and ADB worked on the improvement of roads. Now 70% of the high standard road in Vietnam has been developed by Japanese assistance. These road constructions have contributed to not only consolidate the networks of movement of goods and people, but also contribute to nation building among newly independent or unified countries. To meet the request of ASEAN for supporting to enhance the connectivity in its community, Japan has been extending ODA project in the Mekong region to develop two trans-regional economic corridors. These two corridors significantly enable to transport goods and people on land from the Pacific to Indian Ocean. Or the east-west economic corridor connecting Da Nang city in Vietnam to Moramiai in Myanmar, crossing Laos and Thailand. Japan built and rehabilitated the roads in the concerned country and built Hai Van Tunnel, it's a 4 miles tunnel in Vietnam, and the second Mekong International Bridge in Laos, which enabled this corridor operational in 2006. And along the southern economic corridor linking to Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, Phnom Penh in Cambodia, and Bangkok in Thailand, and Dawei in Myanmar, Japan constructed Tsubasa Bridge over Mekong River and improved the roads in Cambodia. Further work is needed in Myanmar between Thai border and Dawei. In energy sector, Japan constructed 6 hydro plants and 6 thermal power plants in Malaysia, with a total generating capacity of 2,600 megawatts, which shared 35% of all electricity supply capacity in 1995, when Japan stopped extending yen loan to Malaysia due to its growth of development level. In Indonesia, 4 hydro plants, 7 thermal plants, and 1 geothermal plants. about 10,000 megawatts. And in Vietnam, 4 hydro plants, 6 thermal plants amount to 4,600 megawatts. On human resource development, Japan started its technical assistance in 1954. Since then, JICA has accepted nearly 200,000 Southeast Asia trainers for its 2 weeks to 1 year programs on various fields in Japan, and sent about 60,000 Japanese experts to the countries in the regions for capacity building. Japan also established or upgraded many technical institutions and vocational industrial training centers, through which Japan has transferred a wide range of skills, techniques, and know-hows. Currently, Japan is implementing 5-year Industrial Human Resource Development Corporation Initiative 2.0, which aims to train 80,000 highly skilled human resources in Asia from 2018. In addition, most of Japan's infrastructure loan projects have been designed to incorporate the components of training and technical transfer, as as we will see an example later. Japan's focusing on these 3 categories is because its government believes in the importance of attracting more foreign direct investments to boost the economy of the recipients. Economically efficient infrastructure investment would raise the productivity of workers and reduce the cost of production and transaction. Reliable and stable supply of electricity is also crucial for the smooth operation of factories. In accordance with JETRO surveys, the level of development of infrastructure, together with quality of local workers, has always been one of the most important elements for Japanese companies to examine a new investment in a foreign country. In some countries, Japan has implemented a comprehensive regional industrial zone development plan, furnished with a package of constructing a trade port and other basic infrastructures. The development project of Eastern Seaboard, 80 miles east of Bangkok, Thailand, in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The main portion of which are the construction of Lemchaban Port, accompanied by the development of access roads, railways, water pipeline, and the gas plant. The project functioned well, and they attracted a huge automotive investment, including major Japanese car companies, Ford and BMW, and turned this area into Detroit of Asia. Now this area produces more than 2 million cars annually. The triangle region between Hanoi, Khon and Haiphong. Haiphong is the outer port of Hanoi, 70 miles east of the capital. This region development project in Vietnam, accompanied by rehabilitation and extension of Haiphong Port and Kai Lan Port, building a new Lac Phen Port and upgrading its trunk roads network and new bridges, as well as construction of new thermal power plants since the late 1990s, are also another good example. The success of this development project has been proven by the recent high economic growth of Vietnam through FDI inflows. Many Asian companies invested in this area. My recent endeavor is the Tirawa project in Myanmar. This SEG started its operating a year ago. Toyota announced its investment to Tirawa last year. When Japan works on infrastructure projects, usually Japan first starts with hammering out a longer-term development study or master plan on the region or sector, with analyzing and predicting the future demand and movement of goods, services, and people, and consider optimal infrastructure options for a better economic development of the recipient country in an effective and socially friendly manner. Then Japan discussed with the recipient government about priority projects. Once the priority project was agreed, JICA conducted a feasibility study including environment and social impact study, and the Japanese government finalized and proceeded to implement the project with the close consultation with the recipient government. Against the background of the deteriorating traffic congestions in major Asian cities and CO2 reduction movements, a striking tendency in recent Japan transport sector ODA in Asia has been big number of subways, railway projects. Japan has been extending its assistance to build huge and comprehensive subway urban railway system in Delhi since 1996, over 4 phases, and now Delhi Metro railways reach the length of more than 200 miles, longer than Tokyo subway lines. By 2025, it's to reach 280 miles, exceeding London Tube network and New York City Metro, 245 miles. Japan has not only financed the majority, but also been transferred its technology and know-how about safe and punctual operation, as well as maintenance of the system, through dispatching experts and training Delhi Metro staffs in Japan. As I mentioned earlier, the transfer of technology and know-how was designed to incorporate in this project. Currently, the Delhi Metro has been operating without no major accidents. 99.9% of its trains arrive within 1 minute of schedule. And at peak hours, the train comes every 2.5 minutes. I don't know how the people here perceive the punctuality of Indians, but I think it's amazing. The success of Delhi Metro project transmitted the favor for subway to other Indian big cities and resulted in their love calls to JICA. Finally, its other 5 big cities, namely Bangalore, Kolkata, Chennai, Mumbai, Ahmedabad, got Japan subway project after Delhi. In Southeast Asia countries, Japan's railway assistance began in Thailand. At first, JICA developed Mass Rapid Transit Master Plan, MMAP, for the Bangkok metropolitan region, and the Thai government endorsed it in 1994. Blue Line subway project started in 1998 and was completed in 2004. And this project was followed by Purple Line project, which completed in 2016. And the Red Line project, hopefully it will start its operation this year, while JICA developed MMAP2 for further Bangkok area railway network plan in 2017. Jakarta Citizen started to enjoy its first ever subway in May last year, and its extension is under construction now. This MRT's on-time performance rate is already as high as 99.8%. 20-kilometer long Ho Chi Minh City Line, one urban railway project, which includes 2.5 kilometer underground segment, is close to its completion. Last year, in accordance with the roadmap for transport infrastructure for Metro Manila and its surrounding area, first ever 30-kilometer Metro Manila subway in the Philippines started its constructions. As for mid-distance intercity railways, Japan completed the rehabilitation of North-South Railway of Vietnam, accompanying the replacement of 63 decaying bridges. In Myanmar, Japan is now implementing Yangon Mandalay Rail Improve project, which plans to shorten the travel time of all 390 miles distance from current 14 hours to 8 hours. In the Philippines, North-South Commuter Railway project is under implementation in cooperation with the ADB, which connect the track to Calamba in Laguna, almost 100 miles.
And Makoto, could I have you 1 more minute, please?
Okay. And most of these recent Indonesia, Vietnam, and Philippines structure Yendong project have been financed with a special term for economic partnership or step conditions. Under this financing scheme, loans are expected with 0.1% interest rate, with a grace period of 12 years and 40 years repayment period. This scheme presents a window of opportunity for collaboration between Japanese and local companies in this country, because a large portion of financing usually go to mostly local companies while only at least 30% of the total contract price shall be used to goods and services provided by Japanese companies. With state-of-the-art technology participating Japanese companies, this scheme served as an avenue for knowledge and technologies transfer. Japanese government has been proud of this scheme, but a nightmare came to Japanese government when in aforementioned Delhi Metro project, the procurement of its rolling stocks resulted in coming from non-Japanese company, most from Hyundai Rotem. The Japanese government was harshly criticized by its politicians, claiming that Delhi citizens who saw Hyundai Rotem train running in Delhi Metro line surely consider this 100 billion US dollar project was assisted by Korea, which is not a finance at all. I believe that
In the interest of time, I think
Okay.
we're going to have to move on to Bart now, but we can circle back around in the Q&A to talk more about
just
Japan.
20 seconds.
Okay.
I believe that this ODA to the region for the last 6 years has contributed to the economic development of Southeast Asia. This reliable and efficient structure surely attracts FDI. As a matter of fact, Japanese FDI stock in Southeast Asia increased 6.5 times as much over the last 15 years. What I want to say is we distill the essence of quality insurance discussion from this experience of this past Japanese ODA achievement. Japan has been extending ODA for decades in accordance with these quality infrastructure principles. We are never inventing new standards to counter the other. Sorry.
Thank you, Makoto. All right, and now Bart is going to discuss for us the role of the ADB in infrastructure development in Southeast Asia.
Thank you very much, Shannon, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for organizing today's event and the government of Japan for its sponsorship of the program. Shannon, your publication, The Diplomat, I don't know if people are familiar with it, but it does a fantastic job of convening the diplomatic community here around a lot of very interesting foreign policy issues. So just very briefly, I assume that some of you are at least vaguely familiar with the Asian Development Bank. A word or two about what we're doing, but perhaps of greater interest, I want to talk a little bit about the infrastructure needs of Southeast Asia. So ADB was set up in the mid-1960s, headquartered in the Philippines, from which I just returned the day before yesterday. It was set up to channel financing to developing Asia and the Pacific at a time when social indicators, economic indicators were extremely low. Asia was very rural, it was very poor. And so ADB was set up mostly by countries in the region, as well as with donor support from countries in North America, in Europe, and Japan. The leading shareholders of ADB, co-leading shareholders, are the United States and Japan, which together own about 15 to 16% of the institution. Over 70% of the 68 member countries of ADB are in the Asia-Pacific region, and the vast majority of our 3,200 staff, sprinkled in 40 different offices, including a small one here in Washington, are originally from the Asia-Pacific region. And in a nutshell, what we're doing is providing financing, knowledge, capacity building, and other forms of support to developing countries, which over time increasingly are less and less poor. Much of our membership these days are middle-income countries, having over the last few decades risen up the ranks, so their needs in that course of time have changed. One thing that hasn't changed so much, though, is a tremendous need for infrastructure investment, and I thank John for alluding to that in his opening remarks. By the way, the Reconnecting Asia project of CSIS is one that I would refer you to if you are interested in infrastructure development across Asia and Pacific, a fantastic collection of detail on projects and financing in the region. We at ADB estimate that Southeast Asia requires some $3.15 trillion of infrastructure investment between 2016 and 2030. And that comes out to, as John mentioned, about $210 billion a year. That is, in our view, climate adjusted. So in other words, that takes into account not just the need for roads and for ports and such, but also the need to take into account climate change, so climate proofing of projects and also climate mitigation. So that's a massive amount of money in terms of infrastructure financing needs, and yet less than half of those needs are currently being met. And about 92% of what is financed in terms of infrastructure in Southeast Asia is provided by the public sector. So what we're finding is a major gap. Over half of the identified needs in, to be specific, the power sector, transport, water and sanitation, and ICT. Great need for private investment. And so moving forward in the years ahead, what's going to be required are new tools and mechanisms and reforms in institutions and procedures and regulations in countries to facilitate more private sector investment, not only from outside the region, which maybe 50, 55 years ago when we were set up, where a lot of the financing was coming from, but increasingly this region has resources that it can tap through more efficient capital markets, building up the bond market, and through government reforms such as tax reform, improving administration, reducing energy subsidies. So ADB, for its part, is financing in a variety of sectors, both the hard and soft side of development. We're active in education and health, in the finance sector as well, and public sector management, but we're best known for the infrastructure part. So coming back to those roads and bridges and power and transmission lines and that sort of thing. We are driven with a vision to the year 2030 to promote greater resilience, sustainability, and inclusiveness, as well as prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region. Be happy in the next period during Q&A to elaborate a bit more, but I would just leave you with this thought that as much as we're doing as the largest development bank, multilateral development bank in the region in terms of financing, as much as we're doing, it's only a small fraction of the overall needs. So we're working constantly with partners to try to find ways to catalyze the massive investment that's required to lift those remaining in poverty out of poverty and to help chart a path for continued and greater prosperity in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Bart. And we're going to wrap up the panelist remarks section with Myun, who's going to bring us back a little bit to the geopolitical aspect of all this infrastructure we've been talking about.
Thank you, Shannon. I'd like to briefly cover the ongoing U.S. effort to strengthen infrastructure investment in Southeast Asia in order to place them into the strategic context of the great power competition with China, and I'd like to provide some policy recommendation for the United States and allies and partners in advance of the coming U.S.-ASEAN summit next month. So the U.S. has been in the process of restructuring its development finance apparatus to increase its capacity to organize and provide an alternative to the Chinese BRI. And the key piece of this has been the BUILD Act, Better Utilization of Investment Leading to Development Act in 2018. And then the act created new agency, IDFC, the International Development Finance Corporation, and then which brings together a number of existing development finance functions that were previously under the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, and then partially USAID. And I would be happy to talk more about the more details about the U.S. ongoing efforts at the second round of the discussion, because I like to also jump into the broader conversation. But then, Last year in November, we also heard that there's a Blue Dot Network and as an outgrowth of the trilateral US, Japan, Australia effort, and to enhance the public-private partnership. So all of this restructuring and also this ties into 3 U.S. initiatives under this free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. 1 is digital connectivity, and 2, infrastructure investment, ITAN, and then the Asia Edge, Asia enhancing development and growth through energy. So this initiative, and along with this BUILD Act, plug into a greater multilateral effort among U.S. allies and partners in the region to amplify one another's overlapping activities in a way that provides a coherent, appealing alternative to BRI project. And as I briefly mentioned, I like to place them into a great power competition context and just try to think from a broader picture. And the ultimate goal of the great power competition, at least for the United States, I think is clear. First, the U.S. wants to update and revitalize and defend this rules-based international order that affirms values and norms that has emerged after the end of World War II. And second, U.S. would like to see China become a constructive part of that system in the future. However, when we are talking about all of this infrastructure development, and then when it comes to working with allies and partners in the region, what I see as the biggest challenge with executing this strategy against China is tremendous transitional challenge facing those Asian countries which would seek to align themselves with U.S. vision. So one example would be Singapore's Prime Minister. He stated very frankly in Shangri-La and then the recent CNN interview with Farid Zakaria, saying that most countries in South Asia are simply not interested in making an explicit choice between the United States and China and would rather stay economically engaged with both countries in order to maximize their own benefits. And also, we are hearing many of these very similar concerns from the region. So the countries, they fear Chinese dominance, and they want to diversify economic dependence away from China, but they cannot afford to diversify quickly, and they cannot declare their intentions publicly. So I would say all the U.S. effort laid out, and it sounds all very logical on paper, but we are now at a critical juncture at which they must demonstrate that how they will effectively translate into reality, and particularly when it comes to coordinating with allies and partners. So having said that, I would like to make a few recommendations for the U.S. government and Japan ahead of the upcoming ASEAN-U.S. summit next month. And first, on the subject of messaging, I think both the U.S. and Japan need to do a more effective messaging campaign to highlight the scope and depth of their existing efforts. And as John said, and Iori-san, and Japan is investing more money to infrastructure investment in ASEAN and Southeast Asian countries than China. And John Hillman already offered a number, and then and actually it represented a 30% increase between 2016 and 20, and which included reform, streamlined the process of loans, and provided additional guarantees against losses to encourage private companies to participate in infrastructure projects. However, despite the data clearly demonstrating the greatest level of Japanese investment, I think we'll probably find many people in the region simply assume that Chinese investment already outpaces of anyone else. So it is important to convey to the public in the region and beyond that Japan and the United States are committed and they will be deeply invested in the region. So U.S. must work to improve the regional perceptions of its commitment to engagement in Southeast Asia. And one of the striking examples, President Trump, he skipped the U.S.-ASEAN summit 2 years in a row. And so last year there was O'Brien, and then 2 years ago there was a Vice President Pence. And I think it left a significant negative impression on the regional leaders, and because there's a clearly disconnect between what U.S. calls for and then the absence of the U.S. president. So hosting of the summit in Las Vegas, I think it's a step in the right direction. And second, which is very similar to what Bart mentioned, I think it is critical that U.S. Be strategic in how it frames its investment strategy to regional stakeholders. So as I noted, a zero-sum approach requiring a binary choice would not be appealing to regional stakeholders, and U.S. must highlight that multi-stakeholder project driven by public-private partnership based on the principles of trust and transparency are a more effective means of securing the $3 trillion that also Bart mentioned, and then he said then slightly more than $200 million per year. So, and the key is to show how to encourage the U.S. companies and also private sector of U.S. allies and partners to actually participate in that effort. And third, I want to talk about in targeted infrastructure investment, and I will wrap up here. And which means is that while U.S. and its allies and partners, they must be bold and strive to be the leaders in the drive to narrow the region's infrastructure gap, but then they also must also be realistic. So rather than spreading limited sources too thin, I think it will be useful for U.S. effort to concentrate on countries and projects with greatest strategic impact. And first, Vietnam strikes me as a good example, and Iori-san, he gave us many examples of the ongoing projects from Japan. And Vietnam, I think, is a very good example, stable middle power, and then it's the fastest growing country in the world. And it's sharing its borders with China and many, many countries, and in terms of land and maritime. And Japan is already making investment priority, for Vietnam, and then it already outpassed China in terms of the investment, in terms of size of the number. And also we've already seen signs of increasing opportunities for U.S.-Vietnam collaboration engagement, and highlighted by the March 2018 port call by the U.S. aircraft carrier Carl Vinson to Da Nang. And also there's a U.S.-Japan Mekong Power Partnership, also Iori-san laid out. And the second country I would like to point out is Indonesia, and where strategic U.S. investment can help narrow the gap with China. And China has according to some of the Fitch analysis, is 93 billion versus 75 billion from Japan. And Indonesia has a huge population, world fourth largest population, and then the most populous Muslim country, and the world largest island country, and then it's in between India and Pacific Ocean, and has major energy resources, but still requires a lot of infrastructure to put them into good use. So and there's a lot of ongoing project, and then future project in terms of Asia Edge, and then the U.S. and GSEP, including the gas-fired power plant, and then 11 renewable energy project. And I think this effort would help balance Chinese industrial project in the country, and would be a lot more potential for U.S.-Japan collaboration. And I would stop here, and then happy to discuss more with our fellow colleagues.
Thank you, Myun. I want to circle us back around to the Southeast Asian countries themselves. We've been talking a lot about the interests of China, the U.S., and Japan, but as John mentioned, Southeast Asian countries are probably the most influential actors because they're the ones who are actually deciding who to partner with. So could you talk a little bit more about the Southeast Asian perspective? How, as we've heard, they don't want to be forced to choose between the U.S. and China or Japan and China. So how are they engaging with this complex question of getting desperately needed infrastructure funding?
Yeah, so I think it's a balancing act, and depending on how big the projects are, it can be a dangerous balancing act. If you're talking about really big ticket rail projects or big ticket power projects, and if you're talking about countries with smaller GDP, these are really consequential decisions. And so I think part of what they're doing is a little bit of bargaining and diversification. So I think you see most leaders from ASEAN go and court investment from multiple sources, and they'll be often strategic in how they do it. They'll go to Japan and then China, or China and then to Japan. They're also, I think, learning from each other's experiences. And so there have been a few examples of projects where country A gets a lower interest rate, and then country B is going to use that to bargain for its own interests. And so I think that from as the U.S. thinks about how it might be able to encourage better outcomes, increasing transparency around these projects, particularly the Chinese projects, can strengthen the bargaining position of these countries. And the U.S. already does provide some technical assistance, and others, including the Asian Development Bank, do as well. And there have been some, I think, successful examples of that. A port in Myanmar initially estimated to cost $7.2 billion was renegotiated, rescoped. The port that they ended up with, the proposal was not the same one that they began with, but that's great. It's a project that is closer to fitting the needs of that country, and the U.S. provided some technical support to make that happen. Relatively small investment for the U.S. and $6 billion savings for Myanmar. So I think that's another constructive way the U.S. can continue to be engaged. And then I'm struck also as we think about the historical elements here. There are some leaders, Mohammed Mahathir, they've been playing this game for a long time. He was courting Japanese investment in the 80s for infrastructure projects, and came into office criticizing the Belt and Road, renegotiated some deals, and I think that's a pattern that you can see in other countries as well. This idea of a challenger coming into office, criticizing an effort, and then renegotiating rather than sort of breaking from it entirely. And so his criticism of the Belt and Road has turned, and he was at the last Belt and Road Forum saying that this is a great idea. And so I think that there's some strategic bargaining happening there as well.
Right. So one point that you mentioned is that the needs these countries have do not always match the interests of the funders. And I think that's something that Bart was speaking to as well, that occasionally where the area of the urgent need is not the one that is receiving the most interest. So Bart, could you talk a little bit more about where you see this gap being the biggest, and are there strategies that the ADB is pursuing to try and move interest closer towards filling these needs?
Sure, happy to. So I talked about this large infrastructure investment gap, and to provide a little bit more color around that, close to 90% of it is in the power and transport areas. So yes, there's still investment needed in water and sanitation, ICT, but it's overwhelmingly in transport connectivity and also in the provision of power. And these are areas in our own portfolio that are very prominent. In fact, transport and power happen to be the areas that we provide more investment to than any other. I want to come back to an issue that was just being discussed about countries making decisions about where to receive financing from. And while I talk about how we've provided financing and continue to do so in different areas, I didn't say much about how we approach a project. We don't just go to a country and say, here's a bunch of money and pay us back, right? With any of our funding, whether it's sovereign lending to the government or it's a private sector investment, we have various conditions or safeguards, I might call them. And so we're looking at factors such as anti-corruption. We're talking about economic and financial return that has to be a part of a project. We won't be lending to a country if they're in debt distress, for example. So we take that quite seriously and collaborate closely with the IMF. Transparency is key around our projects. You can find a wealth of information about any planned ADB projects and what's in the pipeline. And I think that other entities, whether they're state-sponsored or otherwise, that are investing in the region should be adhering to international standards that also encompass open and competitive procurement. So we uphold these standards. We help to build capacity. I'll provide one example of one thing that we're doing in the Philippines. A couple of years ago, the Philippine government being approached by all kinds of funders. Japan had money to offer. China had money to offer. Multilateral development banks, not just ours, the World Bank and others, as well as domestic sources. They have some big companies, and the Philippines is growing fast and has increasingly public sector resources available. So under the current government, which has ambitions of building, addressing this infrastructure gap, which is particularly severe in some parts of the Philippines, they wanted to get a better sense of well, where are the needs and what should we be looking at in terms of project preparation. So they borrowed $100 million from ADB for project preparation, to do due diligence, to look at different options, to see what investments would bring the great socioeconomic gains. And this is the sort of thing that we could offer to other countries. So it wasn't for a specific project, but rather the Philippines with a multitude of choices, helping them decide what would be good choices for the country at this point in time. And within the last 2 months, they've come back to us and said, this has worked really well for us as we're gauging the options and reading the fine print, the various financing opportunities. We want another $200 million from you so we can beef this up. And as we're looking to expand transport, power, and other infrastructure developments and projects, we want to be able to assess them properly. And I think that empowering countries to make wiser choices, to get beyond what may look like easy money, but then you see the fine print and what the impact is later on debt, for example, or employment. Are locals actually being employed for those projects? Having the resources and the capacity to make good judgments about financing options, I think, is important. So we're rather proud about this particular. It's rather unusual in terms of the kinds of things we do, but I think that this will play a role and could set an example for other countries in Southeast Asia.
Thanks. So it's clearly a learning process for the countries that are receiving these loans, but I think it's also a learning process for the countries that are offering assistance. So Makoto, what do you think are some of the lessons that Japan has learned from its decades, 30 plus years experience of investing in infrastructure in Southeast Asia? What are the most important lessons it's learned?
Actually, infrastructure investment is sometimes, result in the bad conclusion because of the lack of the transparency, openness, and the most importantly, efficiency of the economics. And I want to add one thing that the Japan's public fund, most of the public fund came as a form of the ODA, but recently the two biggest ASEAN countries of the Indonesia and the Philippines is now entering the category of the upper middle income country. In that situation, Japan has to discontinue the step loan. It's a very concessional yen loan. In accordance with the DAC rules. So Japan has to shift somehow to more commercial based than the public financing to these countries in the building of the infrastructures. And most of the Japanese public finance, 90 something was the ODA, but compared to the BRI fund from the China, only 20% are ODA, and the rest is a kind of the other official financing through the China Export-Import Bank or China Development Bank. And we need to somehow to consider the utilize more kind of the OOF funds to collaboration with the public sectors. And but says that we need some investment on the economic energy sector and the transport sectors. Especially in Indonesia, we have some good example of the public financing for the energy sector. But we need more effort to lower the risk of the investing in infrastructure from the private sectors. So Japanese government as well as the other government on the institution like ADB can play a role to kind of facilitate to lower the risk of the private financing for this area.
Thank you. Okay, and I'll ask one more question before I kick it over to our audience Q&A. So Miyoon, we framed a lot of this discussion around the question of China, and oftentimes this is seen as a competition with China. I'm wondering if you see any scope for cooperation with China, maybe engaging with China as a partner to help shift Chinese standards on its project more towards the sort of standards that Japan and the US would like to see.
Yeah, very good and important question, and not easy to answer. But I agree with you in a sense that I think there's a bipartisan consensus in the United States in terms of the strategic competition between the United States and China. But I think it's important to look for any opportunities so that we can answer the key question of whether the strategic competition and strategic cooperation is doable at the same time. We can think about those two questions at the same time. And I mean, it's not really, related to infrastructure. I mean, but to me, but I mean, somewhat related. I think for the two countries, renewable energies and also, and all the technological things is very, very sensitive and not easy to think in terms of the potential collaboration, because we're talking about Huawei and etc. But then, because all of the Chinese companies that are participating and then dominating in Southeast Asia, which is a region of technological leapfrogging, we're talking of the region where they don't have a bank account, but then they do e-payment, and they don't have landline telephone number, but then they have all cell phone, etc. So and then huge. I mean, just hugely influenced by Chinese in terms of this IT and in terms of the digitalization. So I would say one related to infrastructure is renewable energy, and then where we can think about the private sector participation more. And then the other would be it's irrelevant to this infrastructure topic, which is CPRK. That's what I think, because they at least have some sort of agreement in terms of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So having said that, I would like to briefly talk about how to engage the private sector participation. And then when we talk about this global supply chain and the 3/5 of China's computer imports come from this Southeast Asia, and Chinese investment in South Asia grew almost 30-fold to nearly to $40 billion. And we're talking about this Chongqing connectivity initiative with Singapore, and I know we know that this American company HP, they have manufacturing in Chongqing. They moved their manufacturing in Chongqing, and then to try to build their business model with the train delivery system. So right now there's a train coming from China all the way across the continent and then going to European countries, which take 12 days. But then at the same time, we're the companies and we're living in a different era of great power competition, and then the global supply chains are influenced by the trade policy and then the protectionism and also the politics. I mean, in both domestic and international politics. So I think I'm hearing a lot from the private sector and companies that the situation is way different from it used to be, and then where they just need to think about the profit maximization and the profit margin, but then because of these geopolitical complexities, they have to think a little differently. And then I think U.S. should provide and then better articulate the transitional strategy that I was talking earlier in terms of how to, in order to engage countries in the Indo-Pacific and then Southeast Asia, and then to more actively, participate in that grand strategy. And then I think again it is the key to engage the private sector and U.S. company.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot more ground to cover, but I'll let the audience decide where we take the discussion next. So please identify yourself briefly and try to keep your questions short so we can get to as many as possible. And we'll start here with the lady in the black. You have a microphone coming your way.
Hi, my name is Angel, and I'm with Hong Kong Phoenix Television. So my question is more related to the current coronavirus outbreak, and I saw your article on that as well. So I'm just wondering, what do you see as the impact, both economically and, public health-wise, to the Southeast Asia and both China itself? Thank you very much.
Do you have anyone who wants to take this on?
In the infrastructure context, I think the impact runs both ways. So there are projects that are being slowed down because workers returned home to China for the holidays and haven't returned back to work on those projects in places like Mongolia and Pakistan. as well as other neighboring countries that might have closed their borders. So I think there's an impact actually on infrastructure activity. I think the other sort of less tested question is to what extent has connectivity through Belt and Road promoted the spread of, connectivity doesn't just carry good things, it carries bad things too, and that's been true since the ancient Silk routes and the plague. And I think it's a reminder of some of the unintended consequences of these grand connectivity initiatives. So at least those are two quick thoughts, at least on how it relates to the infrastructure space.
I would just add to that like many others in the world, the Asian Development Bank is looking with great concern over the developments. As I mentioned at the outset, I'm just back from Southeast Asia, where I see countries neighboring or close to China already starting to feel the effects. There are supply chain impacts in the tourism industry, which is quite important to, for example, Thailand, one of the places where I was, or even in the Philippines. They're recording lower turnout, fewer clients, and not just from China, but others who are wary of coming out, who are scared of being anywhere near Asia at this time. How long this continues, we don't know. My colleagues who are in our economics department are studying the impact, and of course there are other institutions that are releasing studies showing impact in different countries. But yeah, it's a bit worrying, and at a time when, although Asia as a whole has been progressing over the last many years, we've seen this amazing economic, technological, social transformation. There are still hundreds of millions of people who don't have access to clean water, electricity, etc., in poor parts of middle-income countries and in the remaining low-income countries. And something like this sets us back a little bit. How severely remains to be seen, but it is obviously a concern.
I would like to add that I think there will be the significant economic consequences out of this coronavirus. And we already heard that maybe 2 to 3 weeks ago, Hyundai Motors Company in South Korea, they had to stop their manufacturing because they were not able to get part. And then a week later, Japanese automobile company and other also had to stop its manufacturing because of the same reason. But I also like to add that so a lot of criticism when it comes to this BRI, we're talking about this heavy debt and then the lack of transparency and trust. And there are a lot of analysis in terms of this outbreak of coronavirus, and then talk about this is the problem of Chinese authoritarian governance and regime system, and then again it's trust and lack of transparency. And even though Chinese government, let's say they are releasing the real data, and then there's no trust from the people. They don't believe that those are the reliable data. So I think I would like to just point out your Shannon's question earlier. I think this could be also, we have to think from a different angle that this could, how we can turn this into opportunity, and how US and other advanced countries who have know-hows and etc. can help China to cope this problem.
Okay, next question. The gentleman over here in the blue.
My name is Richard Juning, unaffiliated. Question for the ADB representative. You listed the factors that are considered when loans are given. Is human rights a factor that you look at in a country?
ADB's charter doesn't specifically or explicitly address human rights. If one considers rights recognized, for example, by the United Nations, including economic and social rights, I refer to things, for example, like gender equality or labor rights. These are issues that are certainly taken into account. Where we're operating in a country where there are concerns about civil liberties or impact on populations by whatever the governance system happens to be in place, we certainly take that into consideration. So let me give you a practical example. Whenever we finance an infrastructure project, we're doing consultation with the local communities. If we're prevented from doing that, then we're very unlikely to be financing a project in that space. We collaborate closely with those organizations, both NGOs and international organizations that focus on human rights. We're talking with them constantly, making sure that we're informed of conditions on the ground. So yes, I mean, we address it in a variety of ways. As an economic organization, we're at the same time looking at what is the impact on the people. Look, at the end of the day, we're trying to promote inclusion, we're trying to promote prosperity, and if it's difficult to do that, if there's a risk of exacerbating violations of one sort or another, then we're going to take a step back.
Right. Over here, the lady in the black.
Hello, my name is Bích Thị Trần, former visiting fellow at the East West Center. So before I ask my question, I just want to say thank you to Japan quickly because for what it has done to Vietnam, because I'm Vietnamese. So my question is to Bart. So you mentioned that the ADB looks at the corruption when it evaluates the potential projects. The fact is that in South Asia, many countries very corrupted, but the ADB has been investing in a lot of projects still carry on. So I just wonder how much corruption is okay, and what's the limit? Thank you.
From our perception, from our perspective, I should say, no corruption is what is our stance. So over the years, we've built up our capacity to minimize the risks of funds being misused. Where there are allegations of corruption, we investigate them. We have stopped financing where corruption has come into view. By the very nature of corruption, it's not something that's sitting present, obvious most of the time. It's done in the shadows. It's hard to find. You can suspect it, but you don't necessarily know it. So it's not an easy thing all the time to know it's actually taking place. But we provide mechanisms, including anonymous tips in local languages, not just English, and we investigate issues, and if, again, there's a strong suspicion of corruption, we will take it up with government authorities. In your country, we have provided tens of billions of dollars of financing in grants and in loans, and you've probably, if you've spent time in Vietnam in the last few years, you've probably driven on roads that we've helped to finance. And in each case, we do audits, we do checks, and try to ensure that our financing is being used for what it's supposed to be used for, as opposed to going into pockets that they shouldn't. In what regard? I can't speak to the specific circumstances of Vietnam and level of corruption. All I can say is in the context of ADB finance projects, compared to 10 or 20 years ago, we're much more vigilant. We have greater capacity to monitor risks, whether it's Vietnam or another developing country in which we work.
Okay, next question. We'll see over here, the gentleman in the gray jacket.
Hi, Dan Katz. From y'all's perspective, is the U.S., what it's been doing in response to the Belt and Road Initiative, whether it's the BUILD Act or the Blue Dot Initiative, is it doing enough, and is it doing enough fast enough to really offer a viable alternative to some of the financing we've been seeing coming out of the Belt and Road Initiative? And then also, what could it be doing better?
Okay. Do you want to start, John?
Sure. Yeah. So I do think there have been several positive developments over the last 2 years. The Development Finance Corporation was mentioned earlier. I think that's a very positive development. The fact that Congress was able to pass the BUILD Act, it's not every day that we get enough bipartisan support to get things like that done. And that's the idea of reorganizing some of OPIC and USAID is an idea that had been floating around for a while, and so I think it's encouraging that we had the support to do it. They doubled the lending ability of the DFC from what OPIC was able to do. There are a whole bunch of operational challenges that are going to limit what it's actually able to do in practice, and I think particularly how equity is scored by the Office of Management and Budget. There might need to be additional, either an executive order or additional legislation passed so that the new DFC can actually use that new tool to take equity positions in a meaningful way. So that's encouraging. The Blue Dot Network is another encouraging effort. And I think of that also in context. It's in a way related to the G20 quality infrastructure principles. And both of those to me are part of this shift from the US being very critical, only critical of the Belt and Road, toward saying, here's what we're for. And we're for infrastructure that meets the following principles. The Blue Dot Network is supposed to be one way to operationalize that and sort of give a USG and Japan and Australia seal of approval. And I think that's very encouraging, although, again, more operational details to work out there. And you could say cynically that $60 billion is a drop in the bucket of the world's infrastructure needs. I get that, but there's lots of private sector money sitting on the sidelines. And so the more that the U.S. can do to catalyze that investment, from pension funds and other institutional investors, that's really where the U.S. firepower is going to come from. We don't want to respond to the Belt and Roads, state-driven approach with just a state-driven approach. We weren't able to get $200 billion for infrastructure spending within the U.S., and so I think it's unlikely that we're going to get Belt and Road levels to spend outside the U.S. So all of that to me is very encouraging, but yeah, a lot of operational details now.
Makoto?
As I said, that the Japanese government also seeks the more, utilize of the OOF fund, and the OPIC and the DFCs are kind of the OOF financiers. So already the JBIC and the JICA has a memorandum of cooperation with OPIC, and I'm looking forward to see we are going to see the more cooperation between Japan and the US.
Yeah, I just quickly would like to add that this Blue Dot Network, it's offering the certification. Basically providing certification through this Blue Dot Network, and serve as a global standard. But like John said, it is very promising. I'm personally very looking forward to how it is moving forward. But still at a very early stage. And then the key questions we have to consider is, we are talking about how to enhance public-private partnership through this Blue Dot Network, but it's not that clear yet about the incentive for the private sector, and then what are the compensation to the private sector to invest quality infrastructure. For example, like we have to think about the providing like guarantees, and this is, we're talking about 3 countries, US, Japan, Australia, and so these countries are setting the global standard. So I think working with ADB and other multilateral organization which has in-depth know-hows and experiences, how they can be considered as a global standard, and then how to set global standard. I think that's the key things to consider.
Okay, next question. Right here in the front.
Thank you, Bob Eichert from the Atlantic Council. You've all mentioned power as an important infrastructure sector, especially given the rapid economic growth in the region. And I agree with you on terms of the importance of renewable energy investments, and the ASEAN, as you know, has a target for that. But the reality is that the countries still are building coal plants, mainly financed by China and Japan. And the question is what to do about it before it basically takes the whole 2 degrees C budget from a global standpoint. Now, Japan and China are investing in renewables, but the real issue is how do you see changes in their perception on this, given the problems of climate change, which they're recognizing within their countries, in terms of, let's say, China, in terms of investment in renewables. And and do you have any evidence of that, and particularly in the Asia Infrastructure Development Bank, in terms of their lending policies and trying to bring climate change and sustainability more into the lending process?
Okay, Bart, do you want to start us off?
Sure. starting on the last point, I can't speak to the investment policies in the energy sector for the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. What I can say in the case of the Asian Development Bank is that we have a target of investing some $80 billion in climate change mitigation and adaptation between 2019 and 2030. And it's early days in that commitment, and we're already on track. So that includes, as I say, adaptation, but on the mitigation side, in the last 2 months, for example, we have privately financed. So much of our business is sovereign lending, but we also work with the private sector. So a $37 million project supported in part by the Government of Canada to build a floating solar plant on a man-made reservoir in Vietnam. This is just one example. We've invested in a gas turbine project in Myanmar in the last few years in collaboration with AIIB as a co-financer. You do correctly note that while China is making progress in promoting renewables, and they have strong standards on auto emissions and have closed a lot of polluting plants out of domestic interests as well as a sense of international duty. It is a great concern that you have coal plants throughout the region being built extensively. What we're trying to do is work with countries to provide options on the renewable side where we keep the door open for investment in coal, but rarely do it. We haven't done one for many years because the main reason is to have a dialogue. If you just tell a country, we're not going to talk energy with you if you talk coal, we have to have a conversation, and we do our best to try to steer them toward the renewable side of things, and that's taken off. Geothermal, wind, and others such, and run-of-the-river hydro. We've done lots of these projects in the last handful of years. Yeah, I mean, it's in Asia that is the battle against climate change is going to be won or lost. So we need to see a more rapid movement away from coal.
Okay. And Makoto, did you want to address whether Japan's changing its ODA strategy in response to climate change?
Actually, for the climate change, and recently the most striking energy investment is geothermal power plant building in Indonesia, and it's a very serious issue that we have to tackle by the international community, whole the international community. But also we need some necessity to attract the private financing in this respect. So it's a very tough issue. But JBIC is, already hammered the policy not finance. Rather concentrate on the geothermal and the renewable energy projects.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. We have one from the audience.
I could ask something on China.
Okay, yeah, go for it, John.
So, I just to your question about how countries are, changing their approach to climate concerns, it was interesting to see at the most recent Belt and Road Forum, I think 8 or 9 climate-related initiatives announced, but none of them that I could tell were, binding or, really. I think the jury is out on whether they're going to be meaningful or whether it's just greenwashing for the sake of advertising and trying to improve the image of the Belt and Road. But in the meantime, it does seem like it's a missed opportunity for the United States, because if we do want to draw a contrast between the infrastructure that we support and lower quality approaches, we should be hammering that home. But it's hard to do that when you've pulled out of the Paris Agreement. And so I think it's both a missed opportunity, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also strategically because we should be drawing that contrast.
Okay. Well, I don't see any more questions, so we'll wrap up there. Thank you. Please join me in giving our panelists a warm thank you.